All right, this video lecture is about our first president. If you don't know who that is, you probably should, and it's George Washington. So here's what you need to know about George Washington. First of all, when he is elected, a few notes about the political climate at this point in American history. In the 1790s, at the time that the Constitution is being ratified, the Bill of Rights is being added, and that Washington is elected as the first president, there are no political parties. It's just not a thing that exists at this time, which is really hard for us to imagine, I think, today when political parties are so divisive and create all sorts of conflicts. There are, however, two groups of people who have sort of distinct political beliefs at this time. They fall into two camps. The first are the Federalists. So the Federalists, and this term may be familiar to you from the EPAS that we just did in class, the Federalists believe in a few things. They believe primarily that we need a strong central government. That's who needs to have more control. So these are the people, obviously, who are very much in favor of ratifying and supporting the Constitution. They write all those papers called the Federalist Papers in order to support ratification of the system of government, which really does put more control in the hands of the federal government instead of the states. They also are in favor of developing a manufacturing-based society in America. They really think that industry is where we're going to be able to make the most economic impact. And they're in favor of the British, which maybe is a little counterintuitive because of the whole Revolutionary War, but they think if there are any allies out there who we should be going after, it's Great Britain. The other group of people, again, not a political party, just a group, who don't have as much of an original name, they're called the Anti-Federalists. And they are also, you could think of them as being sort of anti-constitution, or at least anti-giving a lot of power to the central government. So they really believe that power rests more with the states, that it's more important that states have individual control, maybe even the power to change or reject the Constitution if they don't agree with what it says. They tend to believe in a more agrarian form of American economy. They think that farming is really what's going to help us, help American economy stay going. And they also think that if we're going to make an alliance with anybody, it should be the French, definitely not the English. So those are the two sort of major groups. Washington doesn't necessarily have a political allegiance, but he is a Federalist. He supports the Constitution. So when the Constitution is written and it gives us this new executive branch, George Washington is the favorite. He doesn't even have to campaign. And actually, in the next couple of political elections, nobody really campaigns for themselves. It's seen as kind of a tacky thing to do. So Washington is essentially unopposed. He is elected with 100% of the electoral vote. Of the Electoral College, everyone gets to vote for a president and everyone gets to vote for a vice president. He gets every single one of the electoral votes for president. Amazing. Never has happened since then. Under the Constitution at this time, people don't run on a ticket with a president and a vice president. They run as individuals. And if you are the runner-up, if you get the second highest number of votes, then you become the vice president. So because there aren't political parties, this is maybe a little bit easier to understand. Although today, the possibility would be that if a Republican were elected president, their vice president might be from another party. They might be an independent, they might be a Tea Partier, or they might even be a Democrat. This changes in the Constitution because of the 12th Amendment. That's what establishes the sort of party ticket system that we have today. But at this time, in 1789, John Adams gets the second highest number of votes, so he becomes the vice president. There's also two other really important figures who we'll talk more about in class, but who you should know about. They're members of Washington's cabinet, which are his circle of sort of appointed advisors who get to be in charge of certain policies under the administration. First guy is Thomas Jefferson, who we have definitely heard of before, and who is going to be Washington's Secretary of State. And the other guy is Alexander Hamilton, who we've maybe heard a little bit less, although he was also mentioned in today's EPAS, and he is Secretary of the Treasury. Hamilton's really important because some of his policies as Secretary of the Treasury end up creating some conflict, and we'll get to that in a second. So first thing we want to understand about Washington's presidency, the first administration that we have in this country, is its foreign policy. The big question for Americans during the 1790s has to do with the French Revolution. In France, the people overthrow their government right shortly after the Americans overthrow Great Britain, and go a little bit further. They end up dissolving, they kill their king, they end up forcing the Catholic Church sort of underground, and there's a lot of chaos that comes after this. They do not recover and form a democratic society nearly as quickly as America does. So there's a real question of whether or not America should help France. They came to our aid during the American Revolution after the Battle of Saratoga, so should we help them? There is an individual who is known as Citizen Genet. He's a Frenchman, and he comes to America to kind of stir up popular support for the French, for American support of the French Revolution. And he becomes very, very popular, household name, and people are really pressing for America to step in. But one of Washington's first major decisions in terms of foreign policy is to look at how is this going to help America. He's very concerned that this is going to increase our debt, which is already high after the Revolutionary War, and we all know what high debt does sometimes to Americans. And he's also concerned that we're going to become embroiled in a war or a cycle of wars that we're never going to be able to get out of. So the request, Citizen Genet's request, is denied. He does not get the support that he's looking for from America, at least not diplomatically. The other major foreign policy thing that happens, and if you're an anti-federalist, you would be upset that Washington is not going to support France, because remember, those are the people who you really want to have an alliance with. So this next thing that happens makes them even angrier. Jay's Treaty is a peace treaty that the United States signs with Great Britain during this time. So it does a couple of things. It removes British troops from forts in the Northwest Territory, where they still were even after the Revolutionary War was over. It opens up the West Indies, any British colonies in the West Indies, to American trade. And it kind of just creates like this shaky sort of peace between the United States and Great Britain, even after the Treaty of Paris, which ended the Revolutionary War. This makes the relationship even a little bit better. The Anti-Federalists, who remember wanted more of a relationship with France as an ally, they hate this treaty. So despite Washington being a hero, he does get a little bit of public backlash against the Jay's Treaty. But Washington is still, he's still a good guy. He is still considered a hero in the eyes of Americans, and so they support the treaty, they ratify the treaty, even if not all of them are into this idea. On the domestic policy front, getting back to Alexander Hamilton, as Secretary of the Treasury, one of Hamilton's major jobs is to figure out how we're going to pay off the debt that the United States incurred during the Revolutionary War. This is the exact same problem that England was struggling with after the French and Indian War, and we all know how that turned out. So Hamilton takes this job very, very seriously. He does a lot of things. One of those is to impose a new excise tax on whiskey and other distilled spirits, which maybe doesn't sound like a very big deal. So a couple things you need to know. An excise tax is a tax that is embedded in the price of the commodity. So the consumer doesn't buy it. It ends up being paid by the people who make the good. So an excise tax on shoes, if you were to go to the store and buy a pair of shoes, you wouldn't pay an extra tax on it, but the manufacturer, Nike or Adidas or whoever, would end up paying a little bit of extra tax to the government for every pair of shoes that they produce. So here's the problem. Farmers create corn, right? You can tax corn, fine. But corn goes bad. Corn is not a permanent asset. So if your corn crop fails at the end of the year, say that there's a tax of a penny on every ear of corn. If half of your corn crop fails and rots and goes bad, you don't necessarily miss it. But it also means that you don't have to pay that tax on the ears of corn. It also means that you don't get to sell as much corn as if that corn were able to just last forever. So as farmers are looking at this, at sort of how to deal with their crop, and remember, there's still people at this time who don't have as much access to money, right? They're trying to pay back their debts in things like corn. They think of a way to turn their corn, which spoils easily, into something that will never spoil. So what do? They find a still. they mash up all the corn, they boil it, and they distill the steam that comes out of that fermented corn into whiskey. So suddenly they have a commodity that will last forever. Whiskey is never going to go bad, and now the federal government is trying to step in and tax them on it. So as you can imagine, farmers, particularly a group of farmers in western Pennsylvania, get very irate about this and start a rebellion, a revolution. They start throwing tax collectors into jail, refusing to pay the tax, attacking these people, and they really believe that they are carrying on the ideals of the American Revolution. This is a pivotal moment for Washington, who knows that every single thing that he does in the White House is going to set some sort of precedent. So he raises an army, and he puts down the rebellion by riding at the head of the army, which is not a place where a general usually rides. The rebellion evaporates, people go back to their homes, no one is hurt in this clash. But it does, once and for all, set the precedent that if the United States government passes a tax, it's going to have to be paid. No more Shays Rebellion, no more American Revolution style Boston Tea Party responses. This is how the new government is going to be run. So Washington creates a lasting legacy in a lot of ways, both through his foreign policy and his domestic policy. And the last thing he sort of leaves us with before he leaves office is his farewell address. So in his final speech to the American people, Washington says a number of things. It's a sort of final advice to the nation. Mostly this is about the danger of political parties, which, remember, don't exist yet, but he's starting to see them coalesce around these two groups of people, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. So he warns against political parties and also warns against Americans getting entangled into international affairs that are going to be long-standing permanent alliances that are going to hurt us. So thinking back to maybe the French Revolution as a foreign alliance that we would not want to get into. I'm just going to read you a quote from Washington's final address, farewell address. He says, "In contemplating the causes which may disturb our union, it occurs as a matter of serious concern that any ground should have been furnished for characterizing parties by geographical discriminations, northern and southern, Atlantic and western, whence designing men may endeavor to excite a belief that there is a real difference of local interests and views. One of the expedients of party to acquire influence within particular districts is to misrepresent the opinions and the aims of other districts. You cannot shield yourselves too much against the jealousies and heartburnings which spring from these misrepresentations. They tend to render alien to each other and those who ought to be bound together by fraternal affection." So if you look at today's political climate and the way that political parties sort of do really seem to do these things, estrange each other, they create heartburnings, they create jealousies, Washington left us with a pretty prophetic statement about the power, maybe more for bad than for good, of political parties. We're going to talk a lot more about that this week.